All right, I wanted to take the time here early in this chapter to talk about a question I get quite a bit, and that's the importance of a high carbohydrate diet. Is eating a high carbohydrate diet the best way to improve performance? And what I'll say is that it's one way to improve performance. When we talk about high carbohydrate diets, carbohydrate foods in particular, we're talking about pancakes and pastas and grains that you see here, cereals. But if you look at vegetables and fruits, they all are really high in carbohydrates, along with even dairy products. So carbohydrates everywhere, and there's no question that it is one way. I'll say it's one way to improve performance. It may not be the only way, and we'll talk about that later in this section. Here is an example just to demonstrate, and it's been demonstrated many times that high carbohydrate diet works. You basically have time to exhaustion, so you have people running on a treadmill to exhaustion in three different groups: low carbohydrate diet, which is about 40% carbohydrate, normal diet, mixed diet, and then a higher carbohydrate diet where they're probably consuming about 70% of their calories from carbohydrate. And then they also measured muscle glycogen levels. And as you might imagine, muscle glycogen levels were greater in the high carbohydrate diet than the low carbohydrate diet. And then as they put them on the treadmill and ran to exhaustion, as you might expect, it's the higher carbohydrate diet that ran the longest. That's not surprising. And I probably guessed that most of these folks were probably eating a mixed diet to begin with, where they're eating some carbohydrates and fats and proteins as well. So now let's take a look at probably the oldest meal timing strategy, because we start to talk about what to eat before, during, and after, and particularly for endurance athletes, not so much for strength and power athletes. The term glycogen loading is a pretty common term, and that just means you're going to supercompensate your muscle over time by eating a little bit extra carbohydrate. And back in the old days, what would happen is they would just totally deplete their glycogen stores through very exhaustive training and then add those carbohydrates back in. We know that doesn't work for sure anymore, and no one goes about it that way. What we tend to do is people that take this glycogen loading approach, usually in the last week before a competition, they're reducing their intensity anyway, and they're just typically eating a normal diet, just making sure that they get adequate carbohydrates in. And then as they get closer to the event, say 3 days before, their training is severely reduced to anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, or maybe even take a day off. And then that's when you start to add in more carbohydrate. That has a tendency to supercompensate the muscle with glycogen, and so you're ready to go the morning of. What you may also feel is a little bit heavy, because with this extra carbohydrate, you're getting water that's stored along with that. And so, but once you get into the activity, especially if it's an endurance event, that tends to wear off, and it actually can be kind of a good thing over time. The question is, though, is glycogen loading even needed? There's a lot of research out there that's showing, you can achieve high glycogen stores with as little as 24 hours. So you don't need these days and weeks of loading. And with that said, a lot of times the loading doesn't even translate to improved performance, because there's a lot of other factors involved. Performance is a multifactorial thing, so you could have a problem with your mental toughness. You could have training may not have gone that well. Maybe you got injured. So there's a lot of things that could affect your performance. And to finish this up, to talk about one of my pet peeves, it's all these pasta parties that they have for a 5K event, right? The carbohydrate loading parties for a small event like a 5K. There's not any reason I can come up with, other than maybe a social activity, that you would want to have a big pasta party for a 5K. Not necessary. And your glycogen stores are not really going to even be depleted unless you are training, or racing. Your race is longer than 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So skip the pasta party. And people are wondering why they didn't perform well on that 5K on Saturday. It's probably because they overate the night before. So with that, the next little section we'll talk about is what to eat pre-exercise.